The morning mist hung low over Buckingham Palace as Captain James Morrison adjusted his crisp uniform one final time. After 15 years of distinguished service in the British Army, he had earned this prestigious assignment as liaison officer between the military and the royal household. Today marked his first official inspection of the Queen's Guard, a ceremony he had witnessed countless times as a younger officer but never led. Morrison's polished boots clicked against the ancient cobblestones as he made his way across the palace courtyard. The sound echoed off the towering walls, creating a rhythm that matched his confident stride. He carried himself with the bearing of a man who had commanded respect on battlefields from Afghanistan to Iraq. His chest displayed rows of medals that told stories of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to crown and country. The royal guard stood at attention in their iconic red tunics and towering bearskin hats. From a distance, they appeared as motionless as the palace statues, their black boots gleaming in the pale London sunlight. Morrison had always admired these elite soldiers, knowing that beneath their ceremonial uniforms lay some of Britain's finest warriors. Each guard had earned his position through rigorous training and proven himself worthy of protecting the monarch. As Morrison approached the formation, he noticed something peculiar about one particular guard. While the others maintained their stoic expressions, staring straight ahead with military precision, this guard's eyes seemed to track Morrison's movement. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Morrison's trained eye caught the slight shift in attention. The guard appeared younger than his comrades, perhaps in his early 20s, with a lean build that suggested agility over brute strength. The inspection began routinely enough. Morrison walked the line, examining each guard's uniform, posture, and equipment with the keen eye of a seasoned officer. Every button gleamed, every crease was razor-sharp, and every rifle was spotlessly maintained. These men embodied the very essence of military perfection, representing centuries of British military tradition and honor. When Morrison reached the young guard who had caught his attention earlier, he paused. Something about the soldier's demeanor was different. While maintaining perfect military bearing, there was an intensity in his eyes that spoke of intelligence and perhaps something more. Morrison had seen that look before in Special Forces operatives, soldiers who possessed skills beyond the ordinary. The guard's nameplate read Thompson, and Morrison made a mental note to inquire about his background later. For now, the inspection continued according to protocol. Morrison checked Thompson's rifle, examined his uniform, and tested his knowledge of ceremonial procedures. Everything appeared flawless, yet the captain couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this young soldier than met the eye. As the inspection neared its end, Morrison positioned himself before the formation to deliver the traditional closing remarks. The guards stood in perfect silence, their discipline absolute despite the growing crowd of tourists gathering beyond the palace gates. The changing of the guard always drew spectators, but today felt different somehow, as if the very air was charged with anticipation. Morrison raised his hand in preparation for the final salute, expecting the routine response he had witnessed hundreds of times before. The guards would present arms, hold the position for the prescribed duration, and then return to their ceremonial duties. It was a dance of military precision that had remained unchanged for generations, a living symbol of British tradition and royal protocol. But as Morrison's hand reached its peak position, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the synchronized movement of the entire formation, only Guard Thompson stepped forward. The action was smooth and deliberate, executed with the precision of a seasoned professional, yet it broke every rule of ceremonial protocol. The other guards remained motionless, their surprise hidden behind masks of military discipline. The courtyard fell silent except for the distant sounds of London traffic and the hushed whispers of confused tourists. Morrison felt his heart skip a beat as Thompson continued his unexpected action. This was not part of any ceremony he knew, not part of any protocol in the manual. Years of military training had taught Morrison to expect the unexpected, but this moment challenged everything he thought he knew about royal ceremonial duties. Thompson's movement was graceful, yet purposeful, like a chess master making a calculated move that would change the entire game. His fellow guards maintained their positions, but Morrison could sense their tension despite their stoic expressions. The palace staff who had gathered to observe the routine inspection now watched with growing concern and curiosity. Morrison's mind raced through possibilities. Was this some new protocol he hadn't been informed about? Had Thompson received special instructions from a higher authority? Or was this young guard acting on his own initiative for reasons that remained unclear? The captain's training told him to maintain composure while his instincts screamed that something significant was unfolding before his eyes. The moment stretched like an eternity, though it lasted only seconds. In that brief span, Morrison realized that his routine assignment had just become anything but routine. Whatever Thompson was about to do would undoubtedly have consequences that rippled far beyond this quiet morning inspection. The young guard's actions had already broken the sacred rhythm of royal ceremony, and there would be no going back to the comfortable predictability of protocol. As Thompson completed his forward movement, Morrison found himself face to face with a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and the hidden complexities that lay beneath the surface of even the most traditional institutions. The routine salute he had expected was about to become something that would be remembered long after the morning mist had lifted from the palace grounds. Thompson reached into his tunic with deliberate precision, his movement so smooth it seemed rehearsed 1,000 times. Morrison's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, but something in the young guard's eyes stopped him. There was no malice there, no threat, only a calm determination that spoke of purpose rather than aggression. The other guards remained frozen in their positions, trained never to break formation without direct orders, yet their eyes showed the strain of watching their comrade deviate so dramatically from protocol. From his inner pocket, Thompson withdrew a small, weathered envelope. The paper looked old, yellowed with age, and bore an official seal that Morrison couldn't immediately identify from his distance. The guard held the envelope with reverence, as if it contained something precious beyond measure. His hands, which had been steady as granite moments before, now showed the slightest tremor of emotion. Morrison felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the implications of what was happening. This wasn't a security threat or a breach of discipline in the traditional sense. This was something far more complex, something that had been planned and considered with great care. The young guard's actions carried the weight of significance that went beyond military protocol into realms of personal conviction and moral courage. The envelope appeared to be addressed, though Morrison couldn't make out the writing from where he stood. Thompson looked directly at the captain, his eyes conveying a message of respect mixed with urgent necessity. Without speaking, he extended the envelope toward Morrison, his arm steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. The gesture was both an offering and a plea, asking for understanding in a situation that defied easy explanation. Morrison found himself at a crossroads that his military training had never prepared him for. Every fiber of his being told him to restore order, to command Thompson back into formation and deal with this breach of protocol through proper channels. Yet something deeper, perhaps his instincts honed through years of combat leadership, told him that this moment required a different kind of courage, the kind that came from trusting in the character of the soldiers under his command. The captain stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Thompson. As he drew nearer, he could see details that had been hidden from afar. The envelope bore multiple official stamps and seals, suggesting it had passed through various hands and departments. More importantly, Morrison could now see that Thompson's eyes held not just determination but also pain. This was a young man carrying a burden that went far beyond his ceremonial duties. Taking the envelope, Morrison felt its weight, both physical and metaphorical. The paper was thick and official, the kind used for important government correspondence. The address was written in elegant script, directed to Captain James Morrison, Military Liaison, Royal Household. Morrison's breath caught in his throat as he realized that Thompson had known exactly who he was, and had been waiting for this specific moment, this specific officer, to complete whatever mission he had undertaken. The silence in the courtyard had grown so complete that Morrison could hear his own heartbeat. The tourists beyond the gates had stopped their chatter, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding before them, though they couldn't possibly understand its significance. Palace staff members had gathered at windows and doorways, their usual composed expressions replaced by confusion and concern. Morrison looked up from the envelope to meet Thompson's gaze once more. In that exchange of looks, he saw something that reminded him of his own younger self, of times when duty and conscience had demanded actions that went against conventional wisdom. Thompson's face showed the relief of a man who had completed a difficult task, but also the uncertainty of one who didn't know what consequences might follow. With careful movements, Morrison broke the seal on the envelope. The wax was old but still intact, suggesting the letter had been sealed some time ago and carefully preserved. As he unfolded the letter within, Morrison became aware that every eye in the courtyard was fixed upon him. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the air, mixing with the morning mist to create an atmosphere thick with tension and possibility. The letter was written on official government letterhead, though the department designation was partially obscured by age and handling. Morrison's trained eye immediately noticed the classification markings at the top and bottom of the page, indicating this was sensitive material that should never have been in the possession of a ceremonial guard. His mind raced with questions about how Thompson had come to possess such a document and why he had chosen this moment, this method to deliver it. As Morrison began to read, his expression changed from confusion to shock, then to something approaching disbelief. The words on the page challenged everything he thought he knew about his assignment, his role in the royal household, and perhaps even his understanding of his own past service. The letter was dated 3 months earlier, and bore the signature of someone Morrison recognized but had not expected to hear from again. Thompson remained at attention throughout Morrison's reading, his posture perfect despite the emotional weight of what he had just accomplished. The other guards continued their vigil, though Morrison could sense their growing tension. Protocol demanded that they remain in formation, but human nature made them want to understand what was happening to their comrade and their ceremony. The contents of the letter began to paint a picture that Morrison found both thrilling and terrifying. It spoke of assignments that went beyond his official duties, of intelligence that had been gathered and decisions that needed to be made. Most disturbing of all, it suggested that his posting to the royal household had not been the routine assignment he had believed it to be, but rather a carefully orchestrated placement for purposes that were only now becoming clear. Morrison folded the letter carefully, his mind working to process the implications of what he had just read. Thompson's breach of protocol suddenly made perfect sense, though it opened up a dozen new questions about how a young ceremonial guard had become involved in what appeared to be a matter of national security. The morning's routine inspection had transformed into something that would require careful handling, and perhaps consultation with authorities far above his current rank. Looking at Thompson one final time, Morrison saw that the young guard's expression had changed. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet satisfaction that comes from completing a difficult duty. Whatever role Thompson had played in this mysterious affair, he had fulfilled it with the same precision and dedication he brought to his ceremonial duties. The question now was what Morrison would do with the information he had received, and how it would change everything that followed. Morrison carefully placed the letter inside his uniform jacket, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the storm of thoughts raging in his mind. The document he had just read contained information that could change the course of his career, and possibly much more. As he secured the letter against his chest, he became acutely aware that Thompson was still standing at attention, waiting for some response or acknowledgement that his mission had been completed successfully. The captain stepped back and regarded the young guard with new eyes. Thompson was no ordinary soldier, that much was now clear. The precision with which he had executed this handoff, the timing, the knowledge of Morrison's identity and schedule, all pointed to training and preparation that went far beyond what any ceremonial guard would possess. Morrison found himself wondering who Thompson really was, and what organization had placed him in this position. Without breaking military bearing, Morrison gave Thompson a slight nod of acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but one that conveyed volumes between two soldiers who understood duty and sacrifice. Thompson's shoulders seemed to relax marginally, though he maintained his position with the rest of the formation. The exchange was complete, but Morrison suspected that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. The other guards had remained perfectly still throughout the entire exchange, their discipline absolute despite the unprecedented nature of what they had witnessed. Morrison knew that these men would have questions, but their training would prevent them from speaking unless directly addressed. Their loyalty to the crown and to each other would ensure that whatever had happened in the courtyard would remain within the tight circle of those who had observed it. Morrison turned to address the formation, knowing that he needed to restore some semblance of normalcy to the proceedings. His voice carried across the courtyard with the authority of his rank, yet he chose his words carefully to acknowledge what had occurred without revealing its significance to any potential observers. "Guards, you have demonstrated exceptional discipline and dedication to duty this morning," Morrison announced, his tone conveying both praise and closure. "Your conduct reflects the highest standards of the Royal Guard, and you may take pride in upholding the traditions that have served the Crown for centuries." The formal words seemed to release some of the tension that had built up during the unusual exchange. The guards remained at attention, but Morrison could sense a subtle shift in their posture that suggested relief at the return to familiar protocol. Whatever questions they might have about Thompson's actions would have to wait for a more private moment. As Morrison concluded the inspection and dismissed the formation, he watched Thompson carefully. The young guard moved with the same precision as his comrades, falling back into the rhythm of ceremonial duty, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet Morrison caught a brief moment when Thompson's eyes met his once more, and in that glance, he saw something that looked remarkably like gratitude mixed with concern. The tourists beyond the palace gates began to disperse, their cameras and phones having captured what they thought was simply another changing of the guard ceremony. They had no way of knowing that they had witnessed something far more significant, a moment that would ripple through channels of power and influence they could never imagine. For them, it had been an interesting morning at one of London's most famous landmarks. Morrison made his way back across the courtyard, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps he would need to take. The letter in his jacket seemed to burn against his chest, its contents demanding action while its very existence raised questions about trust, loyalty, and the hidden complexities of service to crown and country. He knew that within hours, perhaps minutes, he would need to make decisions that could affect not only his own future, but the futures of others as well. Back in his temporary office within the palace complex, Morrison sat alone for the first time since the morning's events began. The room was quiet except for the distant sounds of London life continuing beyond the palace walls. He withdrew the letter and read it again, this time focusing on details he might have missed during his first shocked reading in the courtyard. The letter was signed by Colonel Margaret Ashford, a name that brought back memories of classified operations and decisions made in shadowy corners of the intelligence community. Morrison had worked with Ashford years earlier during his deployment to Afghanistan, when the lines between military operations and intelligence gathering had often blurred beyond recognition. She was a woman of impeccable integrity and fierce loyalty to Britain, but also someone who understood that sometimes protecting the realm required actions that existed in gray areas of law and protocol. Ashford's letter was carefully worded, using language that would seem innocuous to anyone not familiar with the coded communications common in intelligence work. But to Morrison, the message was clear. There were forces at work within the government that posed a threat to national security, and his position within the royal household had placed him in a unique position to gather information about these threats. The letter explained that Thompson was not just a ceremonial guard, but a highly trained intelligence operative who had been placed in his position months earlier. His mission had been to observe and report on activities within the palace complex, particularly focusing on certain staff members and visitors who had been flagged as persons of interest. The information he had gathered was now ready to be passed up the chain of command, but the normal channels had been compromised. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implications of what he was reading. If Ashford was correct, then his own assignment to the royal household had been part of a larger operation designed to protect the monarchy and the government from threats that operated from within. The routine nature of his posting had been deliberately designed to avoid suspicion, while positioning him to act when the time came. The letter concluded with specific instructions for Morrison's next actions. He was to arrange a meeting with certain individuals within the security services, using protocols that Ashford had outlined in careful detail. The information that Thompson had gathered needed to be verified and acted upon quickly, before the subjects of the investigation became aware that they were being monitored. As Morrison finished reading the letter for the second time, he became aware of footsteps in the corridor outside his office. His training kicked in automatically, and he quickly folded the letter and returned it to his jacket pocket. Whatever was about to happen next, He needed to appear as if this morning had been nothing more than a routine inspection of the Queen's Guard. A soft knock echoed through Morrison's office, followed by the entrance of Sir Robert Whitmore, the Deputy Private Secretary to the Queen. Whitmore was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, with silver hair and the refined bearing that came from decades of service within the royal household. His presence immediately commanded respect. Yet Morrison noticed something different in his manner today. There was a tension around his eyes that suggested he was operating under considerable stress. "Captain Morrison," Whitmore said, his voice carrying its usual cultured tone, but with an undercurrent of urgency. "I trust this morning's inspection went smoothly? I understand there were no irregularities to report?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Morrison's newly heightened awareness picked up on the careful phrasing. Whitmore wasn't simply making polite conversation. He was fishing for information about what had transpired in the courtyard. Morrison found himself wondering if Whitmore was one of the individuals mentioned in Ashford's letter, or if his inquiry was motivated by genuine concern for palace security. The inspection proceeded according to protocol. "Sir Robert," Morrison replied carefully, "the guards performed their duties with their usual excellence. Her Majesty can be assured that her personal security remains in the most capable hands." Whitmore nodded, but Morrison caught a flicker of something in his expression that might have been disappointment or perhaps relief. The Deputy Private Secretary moved to the window that overlooked the courtyard, where the morning's events had unfolded. From this vantage point, he would have had a clear view of everything that had occurred between Morrison and Thompson. "The Queen's security is indeed our paramount concern," Whitmore said, his back still turned to Morrison. "In these uncertain times, we must be particularly vigilant about any departures from established procedures. Even the smallest irregularity could indicate larger problems that require immediate attention." Morrison felt the weight of the letter against his chest as he considered his response. Whitmore's words could be interpreted as either genuine concern for security or as a warning about the consequences of not reporting what had happened. The captain realized that he was walking a tightrope between his duty to follow Ashford's instructions and his obligation to be truthful with his superiors in the royal household. I share your commitment to maintaining the highest security standards," Morrison said, choosing his words with diplomatic precision. "Should any situation arise that requires special attention, you can be certain that I will handle it with the discretion and professionalism that my position demands." Whitmore turned from the window, and Morrison saw that his expression had hardened slightly. The older man's eyes held an intelligence that Morrison had perhaps underestimated during their previous interactions. It was becoming clear that Whitmore suspected something had occurred during the morning inspection, though the extent of his knowledge remained uncertain. "Captain, I wonder if you might join me for tea this afternoon," Whitmore said, his tone shifting back to its usual diplomatic warmth. "There are several matters regarding your ongoing duties that would benefit from discussion. Perhaps we could meet in my office at 4 o'clock. The invitation was phrased politely, but Morrison understood that it was not really optional. Whitmore was giving him several hours to consider his position and decide how much he was willing to reveal about the morning's events. The Deputy Private Secretary was a skilled negotiator who understood the value of allowing people time to think through their options before making commitments they might later regret. "I would be honored to join you for tea, Sir Robert," Morrison replied. "I look forward to our discussion about my duties and how I might better serve the Crown in my current position." After Whitmore departed, Morrison found himself alone with thoughts that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. The letter in his jacket felt like it was burning a hole through his uniform, yet he knew that revealing its contents prematurely could compromise not only his own position but also Thompson's safety and the broader operation that Ashford had set in motion. Morrison walked to his own window and looked out at the courtyard where Thompson continued his ceremonial duties alongside his fellow guards. From this distance, the young operative appeared to be nothing more than another dedicated soldier, serving the Crown with distinction. Yet Morrison now knew that beneath that red tunic beat the heart of someone willing to risk everything for the security of the realm. The captain's military training had taught him to analyze situations from multiple angles before taking action. As he considered his options, Morrison realized that Ashford's letter had placed him in an impossible position. If he followed her instructions and began the process of reporting Thompson's intelligence, he would be acting outside the normal chain of command and potentially putting himself in conflict with his direct superiors in the royal household. On the other hand, if he revealed the letter's contents to Whitmore, he could be compromising an active intelligence operation and putting Thompson at risk. The young operative had trusted Morrison with his safety by choosing him as the recipient of this sensitive information. Breaking that trust could have consequences that extended far beyond their individual fates. Morrison's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of his aide, Lieutenant Sarah Collins, who entered with a stack of routine paperwork requiring his attention. Collins was a bright young officer who had proven herself capable of handling complex administrative tasks with efficiency and discretion. As she briefed him on the day's remaining schedule, Morrison found himself wondering if she might be more than she appeared to be as well. The paranoia that came with intelligence work was beginning to affect Morrison's perception of everyone around him. People he had worked with for months now seemed to carry hidden motivations and secret agendas. The comfortable routine of his position within the royal household had been shattered by the realization that nothing was quite what it seemed. As Collins departed, Morrison made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. He would honor Thompson's trust and follow Ashford's instructions, but he would do so with extreme caution. The meeting with Whitmore would be a test of his ability to navigate between competing loyalties while protecting both the operation and his own position. Morrison spent the remaining hours before his tea appointment, carefully reviewing his options and preparing for what might be the most important conversation of his career. The routine salute that had started his day had opened a door to a world of shadows and secrets that he was only beginning to understand. Whatever happened next would determine not only his own future, but possibly the security of the realm itself. At precisely 4 o'clock, Morrison knocked on the polished oak door of Sir Robert Whitmore's office. The room beyond was a testament to centuries of royal service, with oil paintings of former monarchs gazing down from mahogany-paneled walls. Whitmore sat behind an antique desk that had likely witnessed countless crucial decisions in the service of the crown. He gestured for Morrison to take a seat in one of the leather chairs positioned before the desk. "Earl Grey?" Whitmore asked, already pouring from an elegant silver tea service that reflected the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. The ritual of tea provided a momentary respite from the tension that hung between them. Though Morrison could feel the weight of unspoken questions in the air, as they observed the formalities of proper tea service, Morrison studied Whitmore's demeanor carefully. The deputy private secretary appeared relaxed and cordial, yet there was something in his movements that suggested he was operating under considerable strain. His hands, while steady, moved with the deliberate care of someone who was concentrating on maintaining perfect control. "Captain Morrison," Whitmore began after they had both settled with their cups, "I want you to know how pleased Her Majesty has been with your service since your arrival. Your military background has brought a fresh perspective to our security protocols, and your integration with the existing staff has been remarkably smooth." Morrison accepted the praise with appropriate humility, though he wondered where this conversation was leading. Whitmore's compliments seemed genuine, but they also felt like a preamble to something more significant. The captain sipped his tea and waited for the real purpose of this meeting to reveal itself. "However," Whitmore continued, setting down his cup with deliberate precision, "there have been certain developments that require us to reassess some of our procedures. Recent intelligence has suggested that there may be security concerns within our own ranks, situations that require the utmost discretion and careful handling." Morrison felt his pulse quicken, though he maintained his composed exterior. Whitmore's words seemed to echo themes from Ashford's letter, yet it was unclear whether the deputy private secretary was speaking as an ally or as someone who might be part of the very problem that Thompson had been investigating. "Security concerns are indeed serious matters," Morrison replied carefully. "In my experience, the best approach is to address such issues through proper channels, while maintaining the confidentiality necessary to protect ongoing operations and personnel." Whitmore nodded thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving Morrison's face. The older man had spent decades reading people in high-stakes situations, and Morrison could feel himself being evaluated with the skill of a master diplomat. Every word, every gesture, every micro-expression was being analyzed for clues about his knowledge and intentions. Quite right, Whitmore said. The challenge, of course, is determining which channels remain trustworthy when the security concerns involve people who have access to the most sensitive information. In such circumstances, one must be extremely careful about who to trust and how to proceed. The conversation was becoming a careful dance around the truth, with both men probing for information, while revealing as little as possible about their own positions. Morrison realized that Whitmore was as uncertain about him as he was about Whitmore. Both were operating in a fog of suspicion that made direct communication impossible. "Sir Robert," Morrison said, deciding to take a calculated risk. "If there were specific security concerns that had come to my attention, what would be the proper protocol for addressing them? I want to ensure that I handle any such situations in a manner that best serves both the Crown and the individuals involved." Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who was about to reveal something significant. "Captain, there are times when the traditional protocols must be set aside in favor of more direct action. Sometimes protecting the Crown requires us to operate outside normal channels, to trust our instincts rather than bureaucratic procedures. The question becomes whether one has the courage to act on incomplete information when the stakes are high enough." Morrison understood that they had reached a crucial moment in their conversation. Whitmore was either testing his loyalty to see if he could be trusted with sensitive information, or he was attempting to draw him into something that might compromise his mission for Ashford. The captain knew that his next words could determine the course of everything that followed. "Courage has never been my primary concern," Morrison said, meeting Whitmore's gaze directly. "My worry is always ensuring that my actions serve the greater good rather than simply satisfying my own sense of what is right. Sometimes the most courageous thing is to trust others who may have better information or clearer perspective on complex situations." Whitmore smiled for the first time during their meeting, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. He rose from his chair and walked to a portrait of Queen Victoria that dominated one wall of his office. With his back to Morrison, he spoke in a voice that carried both admiration and concern. "Her Majesty has always been served by people who understood that true loyalty sometimes requires difficult choices. The Crown has survived for centuries because individuals were willing to make sacrifices that history might never fully understand or appreciate." When Whitmore turned back to face Morrison, his expression had changed completely. Gone was the diplomatic mask, replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear mixed with determination. The transformation was so complete that Morrison wondered if he had been speaking with the real Sir Robert Whitmore for the first time. "Captain, I am going to trust you with information that could cost both of us our careers, and possibly our lives," Whitmore said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are people within this household, people with access to the Queen herself, who are working against the interests of the Crown. We have been aware of the situation for months, but gathering evidence has proven extremely dangerous." Morrison felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place as Whitmore continued. The deputy private secretary was not part of the problem that Thompson had been investigating. He was part of the solution. The careful dance of their conversation had been two allies testing each other without being certain of the other's loyalties. "Sir Robert," Morrison said, reaching slowly into his jacket, "I believe we may be working toward the same goal. This morning's inspection revealed information that I think you need to see." Morrison withdrew Ashford's letter from his jacket with deliberate care, watching Whitmore's reaction as recognition dawned in the older man's eyes. The deputy private secretary immediately moved to his office door, turning the lock and drawing heavy curtains across the windows that overlooked the courtyard. The room was suddenly transformed from an elegant government office into a secure meeting space, where secrets could be shared without fear of observation. "Colonel Ashford," Whitmore said, not as a question but as a statement of understanding. "I had hoped she would find a way to make contact, but I wasn't certain how or when it might happen. Your young guard Thompson has been playing a very dangerous game, and his handler has been equally careful about maintaining operational security." Morrison handed over the letter, and Whitmore read it with the speed and comprehension of someone already familiar with its general contents. As he read, his expression shifted from relief to concern and finally to something approaching excitement. When he finished, he carefully refolded the document and handed it back to Morrison. "This confirms what we have suspected but couldn't prove. Whitmore said, moving to a wall safe hidden behind a false panel in the oak paneling. Thompson's observations match intelligence we have been gathering from other sources. But we needed verification from someone positioned to observe the specific activities mentioned in that letter. From the safe, Whitmore withdrew a folder containing photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. The materials were spread across his desk with the precision of someone who had studied them countless times. Morrison could see immediately that this was evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the royal household. The individuals, identified by Thompson, have been under suspicion for passing information to foreign agents, Whitmore explained, pointing to photographs of people Morrison recognized as senior staff members. They have access to the Queen's schedule, knowledge of security protocols, and the ability to influence who has access to Her Majesty during various functions and appearances. Morrison studied the documents with growing alarm. The evidence suggested a network of individuals who had been systematically compromising royal security for months, possibly years. Their activities had been subtle enough to avoid detection by normal security measures, but persistent enough to create genuine threats to the monarchy and the government. The challenge we face, Whitmore continued, is that these individuals are so well positioned that any overt investigation would immediately alert them to our awareness of their activities. We need to gather additional evidence while simultaneously preventing them from causing further damage or escaping justice. Morrison understood the delicate balance required for such an operation. Moving too quickly could allow the conspirators to destroy evidence or flee the country, while moving too slowly could result in additional compromises of royal security or even direct threats to the Queen's safety. The timing of any action would be crucial to its success. "What role does Colonel Ashford expect me to play in resolving the situation?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. His position within the royal household, combined with his military background and security clearance, made him uniquely qualified to take actions that others could not. "Thompson's intelligence-gathering phase is complete," Whitmore explained. "We now need someone to coordinate the final phase of the operation, someone who can work with both the security services and the royal household, to ensure that when we move against these individuals, we do so with overwhelming evidence and complete surprise." Morrison felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized the full scope of what was being asked of him. He would essentially be leading a counterintelligence operation within one of Britain's most sacred institutions, with the safety of the Queen herself hanging in the balance. The irony was not lost on him that what had begun as a routine inspection had evolved into perhaps the most important mission of his career. "The timing is critical," Whitmore stressed, pulling out a calendar marked with various royal engagements. "Her Majesty has a state dinner scheduled for next week with several foreign dignitaries. If our suspects are planning something significant, that event would provide them with the perfect opportunity. We have perhaps 5 days to complete our preparations and neutralize this threat." Morrison studied the calendar, his tactical mind already working through the logistical challenges they would face. Coordinating with multiple security agencies while maintaining the appearance of normal operations would require precise planning and flawless execution. Any mistake could compromise not only their operation, but also the safety of everyone in the palace. "Thompson will continue his duties as a ceremonial guard, but he will also serve as our primary communication link with Colonel Ashford's team," Whitmore explained. "His position gives him access to areas and information that would be difficult for us to monitor through other means. However, we must be extremely careful not to expose him to additional risk." The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from Whitmore's secure telephone. He answered with a simple acknowledgement, listened intently for several moments, then hung up with an expression that had grown considerably more grave. Morrison could tell immediately that whatever news he had received was not good. "That was our contact within MI5, Whitmore said, his voice tight with concern. "They have intercepted communication suggesting that our timeline may be even shorter than we thought. There are indications that the conspirators are planning to accelerate their activities, possibly as early as tomorrow evening." Morrison felt adrenaline surge through his system as the situation suddenly became much more urgent. All their careful planning and deliberate preparation would now need to be compressed into less than 24 hours. The margin for error had effectively disappeared, and the stakes had risen to levels that left no room for anything less than perfect execution. "What are our immediate priorities?" Morrison asked, his military training automatically shifting him into crisis management mode. "If we only have hours instead of days, we need to focus on the most critical elements of the operation and accept that some aspects will have to be improvised." Whitmore moved to his desk and began pulling additional files from locked drawers. The materials he retrieved appeared to be contingency plans that had been prepared for exactly this type of emergency situation. Morrison could see that despite the unexpected acceleration of their timeline, considerable thought had been given to rapid response scenarios. "Our primary objective must be to prevent any direct threat to Her Majesty's safety," Whitmore said, spreading the emergency protocols across his desk. "Secondary objectives include gathering enough evidence to ensure successful prosecution and preventing the escape of key conspirators. Everything else becomes negotiable if necessary." Morrison nodded his understanding while reviewing the contingency plans. The documents outlined a coordinated response involving palace security, Metropolitan Police, and intelligence services. His role would be to serve as the operational coordinator, ensuring that all elements moved in synchronization to maximize their effectiveness while minimizing the risk of premature exposure. "I'll need to brief Thompson immediately," Morrison said, already planning his next moves. If the timeline has accelerated, he may need to take additional risks to gather final pieces of evidence or to position himself for tomorrow's operation. Whitmore handed him a sealed envelope containing updated instructions and communication protocols. The weight of the envelope reminded Morrison of the morning's exchange in the courtyard, when Thompson had trusted him with information that had led to this moment. Now he would be returning that trust by asking the young operative to take on even greater dangers. "Captain Morrison," Whitmore said as they prepared to conclude their meeting, "I want you to understand that what we are about to attempt has never been done before within the royal household. We are essentially conducting a counter-espionage operation in one of the most heavily scrutinized environments in Britain. The chances for success are good, but the consequences of failure would be catastrophic." Morrison met Whitmore's gaze with the steady confidence that had carried him through combat zones and diplomatic crises around the world. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them with the same dedication and professionalism that had defined his entire military career. "Sir Robert, I have spent my entire adult life in service to the Crown," Morrison replied. "If this is how that service culminates, then I can think of no greater honor than protecting Her Majesty and preserving the institutions that define our nation." The following evening arrived with an unseasonably heavy fog that seemed to wrap Buckingham Palace in an ethereal shroud. Morrison positioned himself at the same courtyard window where he had watched Thompson deliver the letter that had changed everything. Below, the ceremonial guards maintained their posts with the same unwavering dedication they had shown for centuries, though Morrison now knew that at least one of them carried secrets that could reshape the very foundations of royal security. At exactly 7:30, Morrison's secure phone vibrated with the signal that Operation Crown Shield was commencing. Across London, carefully coordinated teams of intelligence officers and police specialists were moving into position. The months of planning and the frantic preparations of the past 24 hours were about to be put to the ultimate test. Morrison made his way through the palace corridors with deliberate casualness, stopping to exchange pleasantries with staff members, while mentally noting their locations and activities. 3 of the individuals identified in Thompson's intelligence were scheduled to be on duty this evening, and their movements would need to be carefully monitored to prevent any attempts at destroying evidence or communicating warnings to accomplices. In the Queen's private dining room, preparations were underway for a small dinner with visiting diplomats from Eastern Europe. The gathering was officially described as informal, but Morrison knew that sensitive discussions about trade agreements and security cooperation were planned for later in the evening. It was exactly the type of event that the conspirators would target for intelligence gathering. Thompson appeared in the corridor outside the dining room, ostensibly conducting a routine security check, but actually positioning himself to observe the staff members who had access to the area. His presence was so natural and unobtrusive that even Morrison, who knew his true purpose, had to admire the young operative's ability to blend seamlessly into his ceremonial role. As the evening progressed, Morrison watched the carefully choreographed dance of the operation unfold. Intelligence officers posing as maintenance workers installed additional surveillance equipment, while others, disguised as catering staff, positioned themselves to monitor conversations and document any suspicious activities. The complexity of coordinating so many moving parts within the confined space of the palace was extraordinary. At 8:15, Thompson's subtle signal indicated that one of the suspects had made contact with someone outside the palace using a concealed communication device. Morrison immediately relayed this information through secure channels, knowing that teams positioned around London would now be tracking that communication to its destination. The net was beginning to close around the entire conspiracy network. The critical moment came at 9 o'clock when the Queen entered the dining room to greet her guests. Morrison felt his breath catch as he realized that they were now in the most dangerous phase of the operation. If the conspirators intended to take any direct action, this would be their opportunity. Every person in the room had been vetted and cleared, yet Morrison knew that appearances could be deceiving. From his position in an adjacent corridor, Morrison could see Thompson maintaining his post with apparent calm, while his eyes constantly scanned for any signs of unusual activity. The young guard's training was evident in his ability to remain focused on his protective duties, while simultaneously conducting surveillance on potential threats from within. At 9:27, everything changed in an instant. One of the suspect staff members suddenly broke from the serving line and moved rapidly toward the Queen's table. Morrison's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but Thompson was already in motion. The ceremonial guard's response was so swift and precise that most observers didn't realize anything unusual had happened. Thompson intercepted the staff member with a movement that appeared to be nothing more than a routine adjustment of his position, but Morrison could see that it was actually a perfectly executed defensive maneuver. The staff member was stopped just short of reaching the Queen's table, though to casual observers it looked like a simple case of someone being redirected by palace protocol. Within moments, plainclothes security officers appeared throughout the dining room, their presence so smooth and professional that the dinner conversation continued without interruption. The Queen herself seemed unaware that anything unusual had occurred, continuing her discussion with the diplomats while her protection team quietly neutralized a potential threat. The suspect was escorted from the room under the pretense of being needed for kitchen duties, but Morrison knew that he would not be returning. Similar scenes were playing out simultaneously in other parts of the palace as the remaining conspirators were apprehended. The coordination was flawless, a testament to the months of careful planning that had led to this moment. In the hours that followed, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Documents and electronic devices seized during the arrests revealed a network that had been operating for over 2 years, systematically gathering intelligence about royal activities and security procedures. The information had been passed to foreign agents who could have used it to compromise not only the monarchy but also sensitive government operations. Thompson's role in uncovering the conspiracy was recognized. In a private ceremony, attended only by the most senior security officials. His willingness to risk his cover and trust Morrison with crucial intelligence had been instrumental in preventing what could have been a catastrophic breach of national security. The young guard would continue his ceremonial duties, but his real value lay in his proven ability to operate in the shadows when the ground security was at stake. Morrison found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had begun with what he expected to be a routine salute in a palace courtyard. That simple moment of military protocol had opened a door to a world of hidden threats and quiet heroes, of sacrifices made in shadows and victories that would never be publicly acknowledged. As he watched the fog lift from the palace grounds the following morning, Morrison understood that true service to the crown often required courage that few would ever witness or understand. The routine salute had indeed sent shockwaves through the courtyard, though not in any way that the gathered tourists could have imagined. Sometimes the most significant moments in history disguise themselves as ordinary encounters between soldiers doing their duty. In the end, it was not the ceremony that mattered, but the trust between individuals willing to risk everything for something greater than themselves.